sisters. We don't think we're any different. You know, we're the main culture of the world, you know. And other cultures come to us, and all of a sudden you feel lonely because things are different. And you so appreciated it when somebody made the effort to connect with you and give you a warm welcome and make you feel like you were actually welcomed by somebody. Now, in the Old Testament especially, God told the people of Israel that they were to welcome strangers to their land and not to abuse people's vulnerability. I've just got one or two verses here from the Old Testament, or one from the New Testament, that speaks about that. I'm just going to run through these. Zechariah 7:9, it says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. Administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not take advantage of or abuse the widow, the fatherless, the stranger, or the poor." In Leviticus, it says, "When strangers live with you in your land, do not ill-treat them. The strangers living with you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were strangers in Egypt." And then in Hebrews 13, it says, "Keep on loving each other as brothers and sisters, and do not forget to entertain strangers. For by doing so, some people have entertained angels without knowing it." Well, I'm not sure that I have, but some of you may have. Entertained angels without knowing it. I mean, some people have been angels, but I'm not sure that I've really saw the true angels, you know. Diane has recently been helping a new immigrant couple. And the guy has been in a work situation, and he's been literally taken for a ride by a Kiwi guy. He's been really used. And Diane and I felt really embarrassed that here's a Kiwi guy in New Zealand who's abused, really, a guy who's a new immigrant into our country. And it's showing us again how we can be in situations where we actually are vulnerable to other people. And here in New Zealand, you know, I mean, we didn't think people would do this, but here in New Zealand, out there in the community, people will take advantage of other people. And God's saying to us, that's not how you are to do it. Now, I just want to look at two things this morning, basically, on this whole thing about strangers. Who are the strangers for you? Who are the strangers? Jesus said, "I was a stranger and you invited me in." And the righteous response was, "Jesus, when do we see you a stranger?" We never saw you as a stranger. And Jesus said, "Listen, when you see a stranger, I want you to see them as me. I want you to see them as me, and you're to treat them as you would treat me." God, give us eyes to see strangers as though they were Jesus. That's what Jesus is really saying to us here. You're to treat strangers as if they were me there. Who are the strangers? Well, it may be that the stranger for you this morning, and remember what we're doing in this series is we're really saying, God, what's the next step for me? What's the next step for me? How do you want me to respond to this whole series of embracing the neglected people? Because some of you have embraced them with huge arms. Others of us are kind of putting our toes in the water. What's the next step for me? Well, for some of you here this morning, welcoming a stranger may actually mean welcoming the person who's sitting right beside you this morning here in church. So I want you to turn to the person beside you and say, "Hello, stranger." Now, I didn't say have a 5-minute conversation. I just said, "Hello, stranger." Now, some of you did have someone sitting beside you that you didn't know they were a stranger for you this morning. And, you know, I'm amazed sometimes how we can come to church and we can sit in our seat and we ignore the stranger beside us. And this is a safe place. Well, it should be. And this is a safe place where we should be free to actually welcome the person beside us warmly. Every Sunday there are people who walk in the outdoors here in church. And you know, for some people, walking into a church is a very scary experience. Why? Because this is new foreign territory for some people. And they walk into this place and they feel very lonely and vulnerable. And there's nothing better than to have somebody who warmly welcomes us and says hi. You know, give them a lily hug or something like that, you know. Just to warmly welcome people into the church. There is nothing better. Some of you, you know, that's the reason why you actually stayed, because people warmly welcomed you. And those acts of kindness are really important for us. Sometimes I think we have a mindset that when we're talking about God and doing things for God, we have this idea that we've got to do something big and spiritual. You know? And we never do anything because it always has to, in our mindset, be big and spiritual. But, you know, we often say in marriage, don't we, that it's the little things that are the big things. Don't you say that? Well, the little things become the big things. Squeezing the end of the toothpaste instead of the other end, you know. The little things can become the big things. You know, in our walk with God, sometimes it's actually the very little things that God wants us to do that we ignore because we're trying to look for the big spiritual kind of stuff. And we actually need to get down to just actually the very simple, practical things that God wants us to do. For example, I was thinking about this with strangers. You don't have to walk down the street and look for a stranger. For some of you, actually a stranger that God wants you to do something about is the person next door to you. Because you actually haven't talked to them before, and they're still a stranger for you. And God wants you to reach over the fence and say hi to the person and invite them around for a cup of coffee. I was a stranger and you invited me in, said Jesus. And that may be the extent in which God's wanting to extend your ability